Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first build for Act 2, and it's one that you're going to want to start using immediately. Summed up, you can get your super back in 10 seconds with this build, and your super's damage is increased by almost 3 times from its base damage. On top of all of this, we have great ability regen, tons of weapon support and customization with this build, and all in all, it's just incredibly fun. This is an Arc Warlock build that's been around for a while now, but with the bolt charge changes as well as some new artifact perks, there's a ton of new ways to build out into this playstyle that make it incredibly strong. We have a lot to go over today, so let's hop right into the subclass. Starting off on Stormcaller, go with Chaos Reach for your super. Normally I have some kind of customization built into all my builds, allowing you to use really any super you want to, but for this build specifically, you need to use Chaos Reach. The super regen that this build specializes in does not work for Storm Trance. For your abilities, you can really go with either a Healing Rift or an Empowering Rift with this build. I personally like Healing Rift just for the raw survivability, because Arc Warlock doesn't really have great survivability inherently built into it. So again, it's up to you. I personally like Healing though. For your melee ability, go with Ball Lightning. I'm personally using this compared to something like Chain Lightning, just to help keep our distance between enemies with this build. Again, our survivability isn't as good as other Warlock builds tend to be, and so because of that, we want to play that mid-range a little bit more effectively, and Ball Lightning does that nicely with this build. For your grenade charge, it's really up to you for whichever one you want to use. I personally like using a flashbang grenade because it's the only arc grenade with an arc debuff built directly into it, meaning we don't have to commit to using something like Spark of Shock in order to get a debuffing grenade with this build. But again, if you wanted to commit to using something like Spark of Shock and using any of these other grenades, you can do that too. There's really no restriction behind which grenade you use. On to the aspects for the build. The first one we're going over is Electrostatic Mind. The main focus of this build is generating tons of Ionic Traces and building back our super regen incredibly quickly, so that we're basically spending as much time in our super as we are outside of it. Anytime that we get an Arc ability kill, or we defeat a jolted or blinded target, it creates an Ionic Trace, and collecting that Ionic Trace makes us Amplified. Amplified, of course, got its own host of buffs in this episode, allowing us to have a base damage resist with Amplified, as well as being harder to hit and making enemies less likely to hit us with their projectiles. The next aspect is Ionic Sentry, which was added in episode Heresy. This basically works like Gunpowder Gamble does. As you get kills with weapons or abilities, it slowly builds up a temporary grenade charge, and once charged, you can throw it and deal blinding damage on impact. Where you threw the initial blinding charge will create an Ionic Sentry that'll chain lightning damage to targets and build up stacks of bolt charge with each hit. Quickly going over some things to note about Ionic Sentry, it's giving you stacks of bolt charge every time it's chaining that lightning strike between an enemy. And since it's ability focused damage, this means that this can generate from 0 its own stacks of bolt charge, and when at max stacks, auto trigger lightning strikes with bolt charge. Some weird things to know though is that unlike Gunpowder Gamble, this doesn't count as grenade damage or grenade ability in any way. So normally while something like this I would recommend stuff like firepower or grenade focus mods to support it, this doesn't count as grenade ability damage. It does count as arc ability damage though, so it does work nicely with Electrostatic Mind. With that said though, the fact that you can get these basically for free with this build and generate one of them about every 12 seconds or so, it's a great way to build up stacks of bolt charge very quickly, as well as dealing some nice AoE damage and having some raw blinding utility. Onto the fragments then. The first one is Spark of Resistance, which gives us more damage resist while we're surrounded by combatants, and of course this stacks with Amplified's own damage resistance effect. The next fragment is Spark of Discharge, which gives us a chance of an Ionic Trace every time we get an Arc Final Blow, and anytime we pick up that Ionic Trace, it also gives us a stack of Bolt Charge. Once again, the core focus of this build is to generate as many Ionic Traces as we can, and because of that, this works really nicely because it gives us another way to generate an Ionic Trace, but also gives us free Bolt Charge stacks every time we pick up that Ionic Trace. We're pairing this with Spark of Frequency, which is something I've been using a ton this season, just because while we're amplified, we get an additional stack of Bolt Charge from all sources, which means that anytime we pick up an Ionic Trace and get a stack of Bolt Charge, this now doubles to 2. Or for example with Spark of Frequency, anytime an Ionic Sentry deals damage with the Chaining Lightning attack, this gives it 2 stacks of Bolt Charge. And we're pairing this with Spark of Ions. Anytime that we defeat a jolted target, it creates an Ionic Trace. Now, the thing about Spark of Ions is it's on a 10-second cooldown, and normally I'm not a real big fan of that because it's a pretty long time in between activating this, all for a single Ionic Trace. Normally I would not go with this, but because this build can already get its super back in 10 seconds anyway, and we really only need a handful of Ionic Traces to fully regen our super, getting one back even with that cooldown provides a lot of value with this build, and it's something I highly recommend using to maximize your super gain. Next up, onto the artifact. Again, the primary 3 mods you want to rock with any Arc build this season is going to be Defibrillating Blast, Flashover, and Dielectric. Briefly going over what they do, Dielectric is going to give you a stack of Bolt Charge anytime you kill an Arc debuff enemy. And with its artifact boost, anytime you defeat that Arc debuff enemy, it also gives you a free Orb of Power and a small portion of health. This helps out with the survivability of this build by basically giving you a free health bonus anytime you get an Arc debuff kill, as well as getting a stack of Bolt Charge, which feeds into your survivability and damage output a little bit later. Flashover, of course, gives you a 150% damage increase for every Bolt Charge strike that you deal, and this brings it to an approximate 90,000 damage every time you trigger a Bolt Charge strike. And of course, we're pairing this with Defibrillating Blast, which anytime that you stun a champion, it gives you maximum stacks of Bolt Charge. So in short, you stun a champion, you now get 10 stacks of Bolt Charge. This also allows you to jolt combatants and also heal you off of bolt strikes. On top of those 3 mods though, we're also using Beam Medic, which gives us a burst of healing on rapid Trace Rifle Final Blow. Of course, this works really nicely if our Trace Rifle is an arc weapon that can also debuff on hit, applying Dielectric and getting free stacks of Bolt Charge, which of course we're going to be doing with this build. We're also pairing this with Elemental Siphon. Rapid Final Blows with a weapon that matches your equipped super or a kinetic weapon gives an elemental pickup that matches your equipped super. And the boost with this is anytime you pick up that elemental pickup, it gives you increased super energy. Of course, with something like Geomags and Chaos Reach, this means that you're getting another source of Ionic Traces basically for free as you get rapid kills with a weapon matching your equipped super. So again, something like an Arc Trace works really nicely. And anytime you pick up any elemental pickup, you're given even more super energy, which of course with Chaos Reach and Geomags means that you basically need to pick up 1 less Ionic Trace to get your super, meaning that a 12-second super becomes a 10-second super regen. We're also throwing on Harsh Refraction, which anytime that Trace Rifle is dealing damage to an elementally debuffed target matching their element type, they get a damage increase. For example, an Arc Trace Rifle is going to deal more damage to a target that is blinded or jolted with this build. What some people might not know about Harsh Refraction is how much this damage increase actually is. For legendary Trace Rifles, meaning non-exotics, stuff like your Arc Trace you're going to be using with this build, this is a 50% damage increase, which is ridiculous for a legendary Trace. Again, it's basically a free 50% damage boost as long as they're elementally debuffed. So if you have something like the new Arc Trace with stuff like Jolting Feedback, this means it basically gives itself a free 50% damage boost as long as you deal a few damage ticks to an enemy, which is incredible. For exotics, this decreases to about 30% from my testing. It's not a perfect transfer from legendary to exotic damage boosting, but it's still very strong. Another thing to note about this is that this also works with Microcosm, which has its own damage increase after you use your super. I'll go into that a little bit later, but the cool thing about this is because Microcosm is the only kinetic and heavy Trace Rifle in the game, any elemental debuff gives it the damage increase. Now granted, that damage increase is a bit lower at around 20%. For my testing, it's not 35% or the 50% given to other Trace Rifles, but again, the fact that Microcosm has its own 20% damage bonus after your super ends, and you can combine a free 20% damage bonus with this build, means you can deal a ton of damage with Microcosm as your heavy weapon if you're looking for a more boss-focused DPS setup. The next mod I want to go over is Limit Break, which when you're critically wounded, which means you only have red health, or you have an elemental buff matching your super, so for example, it's Bolt Charge or Amplified for us, it allows you to have a brief period of increased super damage. This damage increase from my testing is about 30%. And again, since we're basically amplified or building a Bolt Charge stacks all the time with this build, it basically means that Chaos Reach at base is dealing 30% more damage, which is incredible. And again, when you remember that we're using Geomags with this build, which extends the total duration of Chaos Reach, it basically means that we're almost tripling the base damage of Chaos Reach with this build, and our super is coming back almost every 10 seconds. And the final mod I want to go over is Dreadful Finisher. This isn't required for this build, but it is something I would recommend for general content, and especially if you're going to go with an exotic Trace Rifle in your energy slot as your primary weapon. In short, Dreadful Finisher allows us to get special ammo by performing finishers on enemies. Anytime you perform a finisher on stuff like Subjugators, Tormentors, or Champions, you get more special ammo. Again, for stuff like Grandmaster Nightfalls, this is very powerful because it basically allows us to have an infinite way to keep up our special ammo use and allow us to use more powerful Arc Trace Rifles all the time with this build. And again, because we're generating tons of special ammo, we can take advantage of all these other effects a lot more often. Next up, we have the armor mods. For our helmet, I'm going with a stack of Power Preservation, allowing us to generate way more orbs of power every time we use our super. Again, since we're spamming our super so much with this build, this is a fantastic way to support our allies and our fire team by just generating a ton of orbs since we're spamming our super so much with this setup. And I'm also using a stack of Heavy Ammo Finder and Special Ammo Finder just to support our weapons. And for the other mods, I'm going with a Heavy and Special Ammo Finder mod for this setup just to support the weapons for this build. I do want to point out, if you wanted to, you could also swap one of these out for a Siphon mod and get free Corpse of Power with this setup. But realistically, orbs don't do a ton for us, and so because of that, they're not really worth investing directly into creating with this build, because Ionic Traces already kind of take care of any ability regen we might have, or the super gain from Ionic Traces is much greater than any Orb of Power is going to give us. So because of that, they're not something I really want to focus on generating ourselves, but we can still take advantage of them in some way. For our gauntlets, I'm going with a stack of fastball just to increase our grenade throw distance, a nice quality of life enhancement, as well as a stack of focusing strike and impact induction. This just builds up a little bit more into the ability regen with this setup, allowing us to get a lot more energy back even faster. And again, combined with Ionic Traces, this is a great way to allow us to get tons of ability energy back basically for free. For your chest piece, again, really up to you, any combination of resist and reserves. I do want to point out though that because the base survivability of Arc Warlock isn't as strong as other subclasses, I would recommend going with at least 2 resist mods just to support us in the certain activity that we're in. Finally, onto our boots, and our exotic for today is Geomags. Geomags has been a classic exotic for Arc Warlock, specifically with Chaos Reach spam, and it actually got reworked pretty recently, giving it a new function on top of it. Briefly summarizing what Geomags actually does, while you're in Chaos Reach, it'll actually extend the duration of Chaos Reach as you deal damage with it, roughly doubling the duration of the super, which of course results in a massive super damage increase. Also, as you collect Ionic Traces, it grants you energy for Chaos Reach, enhancing your super regen. And then the new effect that this got in episode Heresy is that while you have 6 or more stacks of Bolt Charge, sprinting will give you a stack of Bolt Charge about once every second. And what this means is that if you ever need maximum stacks of Bolt Charge for any reason and you can't have other ways of getting it, simply sprinting will top you off in a few seconds. As far as the mods on the boots themselves, I'm going with a stack of Harmonic Scavenger just to benefit our arc weapon, as well as a stack of Elemental Charge. Basically, anytime we pick up an Ionic Trace, this gives us a chance of getting a stack of Armor Charge for free with this setup. And for the final mod, I'm using Recuperation. Again, we're not building directly into Orb Gens with our mods for today. However, we can take advantage of them with stuff like Dielectric from the Artifact mod. But basically, anytime we pick up that Orb of Power, it gives us a little bit more health. Again, adding on another way to heal with Arc Warlock on the setup. And then finally, onto our bond for today. The first mod we're going with is Powerful Attraction, which anytime you use your class ability, it automatically picks up any nearby orbs of power. I'm also pairing it with a stack of Reaper, which worked really nicely, because anytime we cast our Rift, it picks up any nearby orbs of power, and Reaper guarantees our next final weapon blow will generate an orb of power. And again, it's a nice way to occasionally have an orb of power be created without investing directly into Siphon mods and taking away from our ammo finders or our power preservation, allowing us to generate way more orbs for our allies. And then the final mod I'm using is Special Finisher, allowing us to create a special ammo brick anytime we perform a finisher on an enemy. Of course, with stuff like Dreadful Finisher and the Artifact, this adds another way for us to generate special ammo by performing a finisher. What this means for the build is that if we ever run out of special ammo for our Arc Trace Rifle, this is a very, very easy way to generate basically the entire reserves of it back from just a single finisher by spawning special ammo from Special Finisher and then special ammo from Dreadful Finisher. And again, this works really nicely with our Finder mods and Scavenger mods also supporting our Arc weapon. Finally, onto the weapons I recommend using for today. The main focus of this build is Trace Rifles, and so I'm going to go over the Trace Rifles I recommend using first, and then go into supporting weapons a little bit later. The first weapon I want to go over is Cold Heart, which is my go-to exotic for this build, and is something basically every player should have. The reason we're using Cold Heart is because it's one of the best weapons in the game at generating Ionic Traces, and of course Ionic Traces give us a ton of ability regen and a ton of super energy with this setup. Basically, as you deal damage with this weapon, you'll just get Ionic Traces for free. You don't really need to get a kill, you don't need to debuff that target initially, just dealing sustained damage with this weapon will generate those Ionic Traces. And so what this means is that if you ever have a high HP target, for example, you can just unload this weapon into that thing, and in the span of about 10 to 15 seconds, you'll get enough Ionic Traces back from that target alone that you'll have a full super. Besides Cold Heart though, you can go with a few other options. The first one is Lodestar, although it's not personally my favorite, it does work really nicely with this build. The thing with Lodestar is it doesn't provide us a way of generating Ionic Traces, especially extremely effectively, until we have the Arc Alignment effect activated. Now, normally with this build, that's not really hard to do because we're getting so many Arc debuff and Arc debuff kills with this setup that Arc Alignment will basically be activated anytime we're out of our super and can build into our super regen very effectively. But again, with Cold Heart basically giving us on-demand Arc Traces all the time and not needing us to get all these other Arc kills to set it up, it's still very, very strong. The other thing Lodestar has going for it though is that it is a primary trace rifle compared to Cold Heart or other trace rifles you're using, which are special or heavy ammo weapons. Because of that, Lodestar basically has infinite ammo with this setup, and while normally that would be a very big advantage for Lodestar, in this season in particular, we have access to stuff like Dreadful Finisher, and of course I'm using stuff like Special Finisher, as well as a Scavenger, a Potential Reserve, and a Finder mod with this setup. We really don't run out of ammo for Cold Heart at any point, and because of that, it's just kind of my go-to for this build. With that said though, if you really like using Lodestar, absolutely use it with the setup, it's perfectly fine for it. I just believe Cold Heart is just a bit better at focusing on the needs of this setup without requiring as much work to put into it. With that said, there are some legendary alternatives to these exotics though, and the one I want to go over today is Regens. I doubt I'm pronouncing that right, but it's basically the new Guardian Games Arc Trace Rifle. There's a massive perk variety on this weapon, and there are tons of different combinations you can get, but the main one I want to focus on is Jolting Feedback, which is something I've been talking about for basically every single build guide this season. There are a number of reasons why we want to take advantage of Jolting Feedback specifically on an Arc Trace Rifle with this build, so let me go into why that is and why this weapon is so strong. Starting off on our subclass, if you remember, Spark of Ions is giving us a free ionic trace anytime we defeat an enemy that is jolted. And again, Jolting Feedback is a very easy way to prime an enemy that you haven't killed yet with Jolting. Electrostatic Mine also activates because we're killing an arc debuff target, meaning off that one kill, we already have 2 ionic traces. This can stack with stuff like Spark of Discharge, which anytime we get an arc weapon final blow, it'll have a chance to give us an ionic trace. That means we can get 3 ionic traces from a single kill. And we also have stuff like Elemental Siphon from the artifact, which can potentially lead us to having 4 ionic traces off of a single kill from a legendary weapon. So again, to summarize, Jolting Feedback is essential for this weapon, but if you can get it on pretty much any perk combination, it's fantastic. I don't even really have a good combination with Jolting Feedback on this weapon, and it's still fantastic. And the final main weapon recommendation I have is actually in our heavy slot, and it's Microcosm. This is the only kinetic and heavy trace rifle in the entire game, and it's absolutely fantastic with this build because of its exotic effect. The first thing to note is Paracausal Imbuement allows this weapon to get a brief period of 20% increased damage after you use your super. Because this build focuses on super spam so much, this is a very easy way to take advantage of its 20% damage bonus all the time with this weapon. In addition, Paracausal Imbuement also gives this weapon increased super gain on kill, which when combined with our arc debuffing effects and the ionic trace generation of this build, allows this thing to have a ton of super regen potential built into it. And again, remembering Harsh Refraction, this gives Microcosm a free 20% damage bonus off of any debuff target, meaning we can jolt them or blind them, and Microcosm gets an additional 20% damage bonus on top of its free 20% damage bonus with our super. So if you wanted to use this build in stuff like a raid or dungeon environment and you need a weapon for boss DPS, go to your Geomags, put on 3 kinetic surges, and slap on Microcosm with something like Karanos here, and you're set. Because again, simply pop your super, deal a ton of damage with the bolt charge stacking, the jolting effects, the raw super damage itself, especially with the artifact mod, swap to Microcosm, and just hold down the trigger. And this weapon is getting 20% from your super, 20% from an arc debuff, which you've been jolting with your super with this setup. And again, any kind of damage bonus you want to stack on top of this, like a weakening effect from a teammate. If your teammate's rocking Radiant, for example, or another empowering buff, this is another damage bonus. And again, any kind of kinetic surges you might want to swap on gives it even more damage. Again, this build is generalized for more standard gameplay like GMs, but again, something like this is perfectly viable in a boss DPS setup. As far as other weapons to pair with your trace rifle, again, it depends on which loadout you want to use, but in short, any weapon that is specifically an arc weapon that can take advantage of the ionic trace generation or the other effects that this build has work really nicely. Watchful Eye is a fantastic LMG if you want to go that route. I also have this Crux Termination 4 here that works really nicely with this setup, but again, there's a wide variety of arc weapons you can use. So if you want something with quick DPS potential because you're using a trace rifle, again, Crux Terminus is there. You also have heavy GLs like Wendigo, for example. If you want to go in your kinetic slot, again, it's entirely up to you. I like using Tenacious Mastery just because it has great anti-champion capabilities this season, allowing you to stagger all 3 champions with 1 weapon. Again, the build is primarily focusing on arc trace rifles, or specifically Microcosm in the heavy slot. So as long as you have a decent arc trace rifle of some kind, everything else is just complementary. If you want to have a weapon to help deal with certain enemies and activity, go ahead and use that. Again, Tenacious is here for just basically all 3 champions for free. It's entirely up to you. As long as you have a decent arc trace rifle though, that is all that matters. Or again, Microcosm in the heavy slot. With that being said, that is the build for today. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, this has become one of my favorite builds in the game because of how fast we're spamming our super with this setup. Geomags and Chaos Reach have been a staple for Arc Warlock for a number of years now, but with the bolt charge changes as well as the buffs Chaos Reach has gotten over the years, and especially this episode with the artifact and the mods it has, it is fantastic this season. And again, a 10-second super that is dealing almost 3 times its base damage is nothing to laugh at. This is one of my favorite builds, and it's incredibly powerful, able to thrive in stuff like Grandmaster Nightfalls or even boss DPS scenarios and stuff like raids and dungeons, and it's something I know you guys are going to love for yourself. Dim link is down in the description below if you want to try this build out yourself, and let me know down in the comments what you think of the build after you give it a shot. As always, thank you guys so much for watching today's build guide. I greatly appreciate your continued support in these videos, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you so much, and have a great day.